The North was not a land that welcomed men, it was a land that tried to kill them. In Viking times, there was no escape. Snow smothered the earth for half the year, and the sun rose only briefly before sinking again into long nights of darkness. Ice gripped the rivers, winds howled through the fjords, and the cold gnawed at flesh like wolves at a carcass. In Viking times, there was no escape. But the Vikings were not broken by winter, they were forged by it. The men and women of the North learned to live where others would have perished. They wore cloaks of wolf and bear, boots lined with sheep's wool, and slept in longhouses where fires burned day and night. Yet even inside, breath hung in the air as mist, and children huddled close to their mothers to steal warmth. This endless cold carved them into something harder than steel. It was no accident that Viking warriors became feared across the known world, for every man who survived a northern winter had already fought his first battle and won. When food ran low, they braved blizzards to hunt elk, boar, and bear. When seas froze, they cut through the ice to fish. And when even that was not enough, they turned to the longships. The harsh winters of Scandinavia did more than freeze the land, they pushed the Vikings outward. Hunger was often the spark that lit the fire of raids. In smoky longhouses, men would sit sharpening their axes, listening to the storms batter the walls. They knew that beyond the sea, in softer lands, others lived with overflowing stores of grain, fat cattle, and rich treasures. The winter whispered to them, "Take what you need or die." So, when the ice broke in spring, longships slid into the water like arrows loosed from a bow. Warriors rode through freezing spray, faces hard as iron, eager to bring back the wealth and food that would carry their people through the next long dark. To the Vikings, winter was more than suffering, it was proof of their destiny. The sagas told of Niflheim, the world of ice and mist, one of the first realms born from creation itself. They believed the frost was the breath of that ancient place, and that only those chosen by the gods could endure it. And you, with your heated homes and soft skin, would not endure it. You would wake, shivering, stumble into the snow, and within hours the frost would have its claws in you. By nightfall, you'd be stiff as a fallen branch, your body buried beneath the storm. The Vikings would not pity you. They would see you as weak, another sacrifice to the endless winter, another soul claimed by the land that made them strong. This was their world. This was the North. The land of endless winter, the crucible in which the Vikings were born. For a Viking, the first breath of battle came long before steel clashed against steel. It began in the silence, in the cold morning mist, when the sea still slept and the world seemed to hold its breath. The longship cut through the fog like a predator's fin, its dragon-headed prow snarling at the shore ahead. Warriors crouched low on the benches, their hands clenched around axe handles and spear shafts. No laughter, no boasting, now only the sound of waves against the hull and the steady rhythm of oars. They could smell the smoke of cooking fires drifting from the village. They knew what waited there. Soft men who had never felt the bite of true winter, women clutching children, cattle penned fat and lazy. The Vikings did not see them as innocents, they saw them as prey. Then came the order. The oars pulled harder, the ship surged forward, and shields lifted to the gunwales. A heartbeat later, the keel scraped gravel, and the warriors were on their feet. The first breath of battle came with the war cry. It ripped across the shore, a sound that froze the villagers where they stood. Then the Vikings surged forward, a storm of shields, steel, and fury. Axes swung down, splitting shields, biting through skulls. Spears thrust through cloth and flesh, dragging screaming men to the ground. Houses caught fire in moments, thatch blazing against the sky. To fight a Viking was to face not men, but wolves. They struck with savage precision, every warrior trained since boyhood to kill without hesitation. They carried round shields of oak, rimmed with iron, and behind them they pressed forward like a wall of death. The sound was deafening, the clash of iron, the crack of splintering wood, the roar of fire, the shrieks of the dying. To a Viking, this was not chaos. This was order. This was the way of the world. Odin demanded the strong prove themselves. Thor demanded courage in the storm. To turn and flee was worse than death. A young Viking, bloodied but alive, would feel his heart pound like thunder. This was his first raid, his first kill. He would lift his red-stained axe to the sky and shout to the gods, for in this moment he was no longer a boy, he was a warrior. And if he fell, if a blade found his throat, if an arrow pierced his chest, then he had faced death with steel in his hand, and the Valkyries would carry him to Valhalla. To the Vikings, there was no higher honor. You, standing there with trembling hands, would not last a heartbeat. The roar would crush your courage, the first swing of an axe would send you running. And in that single act, you would seal your fate. No hall of heroes would open its doors to you, only the cold earth would claim you. For the Vikings, the first breath of battle was life itself. For you, it would be your last. Every warrior has his weapon. For the knight, it was the longsword. For the samurai, the curved katana. But for the Viking, it was the shield and the axe-brutal tools shaped by the land that raised them. The Viking shield was more than a slab of wood, it was life itself. A round disc, 3 feet wide, built of layered planks of oak or pine, light enough to carry yet strong enough to turn a spear. The rim was bound in rawhide or iron, and at its heart was a boss, a dome of steel that could catch a blade or break a man's jaw when slammed forward. In the shield wall, the Vikings locked these circles of wood edge to edge, creating a moving fortress. Behind it, they advanced like a living beast, every man's strength adding to the next. When arrows rained from above, they raised the shields overhead, forming a shell. When enemy spears thrust forward, the wall absorbed the blow. And then, when the time was right, the Vikings struck. And their weapon of choice? The axe. The axe was not a knight's elegant blade. It was a farmer's tool, turned into an instrument of terror. Some were small, one-handed, perfect for cleaving through shields and skulls. Others were massive, the two-handed Dane axe, its crescent blade wide enough to take the head from horse and rider in a single swing. To face a Viking axe was to face raw brutality. It did not pierce with precision like a spear. It did not dance like a sword. It crushed, it split, it tore, shields shattered beneath it. Helmets dented inward, skulls breaking beneath the iron. The axe was a weapon of fear, and the Vikings wielded it without mercy. But the axe was not the only tool in their arsenal. Spears, swords, sea axes, each Viking carried what he could afford, what his family had passed down, what his chieftain provided. Yet no matter the weapon, the shield remained. Even the richest warrior, gleaming in mail, trusted his round board to guard his life. The bond between shield and axe defined the Viking way of war. First came the wall, unyielding as stone. Then came the swing, as sudden and savage as a storm. This was how they broke armies. This was how they carved their way into kingdoms. You, standing on that field, would hear it before you saw it. The pounding of boots, the roar of voices, the thunder of shields struck in rhythm. Then the wall would hit you a crash of wood and iron, and through the gap, the axes would fall. Could you raise your arm in time? Could you hold the line against men who had swung steel since childhood? Number? Your shield would shatter, your courage break, and your blood would feed the earth. The Vikings did not worship their weapons, they became them. Shields of wood, axes of iron, flesh and blood turned into war itself. And that is why you would not last a day among them. If the battlefield was where Vikings proved their courage, the longhouse was where they lived, endured, and remembered who they were. A longhouse was no simple shelter. It was a fortress against the winter, a temple of fire, and the beating heart of a clan. From the outside, it looked like a great beast hunched against the snow. Walls of timber and turf, a roof sloping low, often thatched or covered in sod, its length stretching 30, 40, even 60 paces. Smoke poured from a hole in the roof, carrying with it the smell of wood, sweat, and life. Inside, the world changed. The first thing you would notice is the dark. Narrow slits let in little light, and smoke hung heavy in the rafters, stinging your eyes. The air was thick with the smell of burning pine, of dried fish, of damp wool, and unwashed skin. And yet, to a Viking, this was comfort. To step into a longhouse after the freezing wind outside was to step into safety, into family. A single fire ran down the centre, its flames licking upward, sparks dancing into the smoke hole above. Around it, people gathered. Men sat sharpening axes or carving runes into wood. Women worked looms, spun wool, or stirred bubbling cauldrons of stew. Children played at the edges, their laughter mingling with the growls of hunting dogs sprawled on the straw. At night, the longhouse transformed. Warriors returned from raids, stamping snow from their boots, shaking frost from their beards. Horns of ale were passed, songs rose loud and wild, and tales of gods and battles filled the rafters. Skalds, the poets of the north, recited sagas of heroes who had crossed oceans, who had faced giants, who had won the favour of Odin himself. For the Vikings, stories were more than entertainment. They were memory. They were immortality. But the longhouse was not all warmth and song. It was also a place of hierarchy. At the high seat, beneath carved beams, the chieftain ruled. His word carried the weight of law. His decisions meant life or death. Around him sat his most trusted warriors, the huskals, while common farmers and thralls ate further down. Even in the longhouse, a man's place was never forgotten. And in the quiet hours, when the fire burned low, the longhouse held its other truth: survival. Families huddled close beneath firs, praying that the food stores would last, that wolves would not come prowling, that the gods would spare them another storm. To live through winter in the north was no small feat. The longhouse made it possible. Without it, the Vikings would not have endured. Now, picture yourself there. The smoke choking your lungs, the cold still biting even with the fire at your feet, the roar of men drunk on mead, their eyes sharp with suspicion at the stranger in their hall. Could you eat their rough bread? Could you drink their bitter ale? Could you live as they did, night after night, winter after winter? Number, the longhouse would not comfort you. It would swallow you, for you were not born to it. But for the Vikings, it was home. The longhouse was more than wood and fire. It was blood. It was bond. It was the heart of a Viking clan. For most men of the Middle Ages, the sea was a barrier, a wall of water that separated kingdoms, villages, and worlds. For the Vikings, it was the opposite. The sea was a road, a highway, the endless path that carried them to glory, plunder, and death. From childhood, a Viking learned the language of waves. He knew the pull of the tide, the bite of salt wind on his face, the way clouds gathered before a storm. To them, the sea was not an enemy. It was an ally, wild, dangerous, but willing to serve those bold enough to master it. And their greatest weapon on the water, the longship. Sleek, narrow, and fast, a Viking longship was unlike anything the world had seen. Its hull, built from overlapping planks of oak, could bend and flex with the waves. Its shallow keel let it slip easily across open seas and glide silently up narrow rivers. Where other ships were trapped by coastlines, the longship struck deep inland, bringing terror to villages that had thought themselves safe. At the prow, a dragon head often snarled outward, carved to ward off sea spirits and frighten enemies. The sail, a square of striped wool, snapped in the wind, carrying the ship across leagues of ocean. And when the wind died, when silence fell on the waves, 50 strong backs bent their oars, propelling the vessel forward with relentless rhythm. Imagine the sight from a monastery on the English shore. The horizon darkens with shadows, the wind carries the pounding of drums, and then through the mist a fleet of dragon ships emerges, slicing the sea like knives. The monks drop their tools, terror filling their prayers, for they know the sea has brought death. But the longship was not only a tool of war, it was the cradle of Viking life. Warriors slept on their shields beneath the stars, eating dried fish, drinking rainwater collected in buckets. They laughed, fought, and sang as the waves carried them. Storms tested their courage, days without wind tested their patience, yet they endured, for the sea was their fate. Without it, they could not raid. Without it, they could not trade. Without it, their stories would have ended in the fjords of Norway and the icy fields of Denmark. Instead, the sea carried them to England, to Ireland, to Francia, to Byzantium, even to the edge of North America. Their ships carved scars across the world. And could you endure it? Could you sit in a sodden cloak, shivering as icy spray lashed your face, rowing hour after hour with no promise of rest? Could you stomach dried herring and hard bread while your body wasted away beneath the endless grey sky? Could you stand upon a deck so narrow that a single misstep would send you into the black waves forever? The sea would break you, the cold would devour you, the hunger, the storms, the endless horizon, it would crush your spirit long before the enemy's axe. But not the Vikings. For them, the sea was freedom, the sea was the highway, and through it they carved their place in history. Few images strike more fear into the imagination than the dreaded blood eagle. Even among the Vikings, a people accustomed to brutality, this ritual stood apart. Was it history or was it legend? No man in the Middle Ages could say for certain. Yet the stories spread, carried on the wind, whispered in terrified voices. If the Vikings wanted to punish you, truly punish you, they might cut the blood eagle into your back. The description was as gruesome as it was unforgettable. The victim was seized, often a captured noble or a traitor to the Norse. Stripped, bound, and forced to kneel, his arms were stretched wide. Then the executioner would take a long, keen blade and begin to carve into the back, splitting through flesh and bone. The ribs were severed from the spine, pulled outward, and splayed like the wings of an eagle. The lungs were then dragged through the opening, draped across the shoulders, as if the man himself had sprouted wings of bloody flesh. Some tales claimed the victim had to remain alive through the ordeal, never uttering a cry of pain, for only then would the ritual please Odin. If he screamed, his soul was unworthy, and his suffering was meaningless. Whether or not it truly happened is still debated. Historians argue that it may have been metaphor, a poetic exaggeration of savage punishment. Yet to those who lived in fear of the Northmen, it did not matter. The image was powerful enough to burn itself into memory. It was said that Ivar the Boneless himself carved a blood eagle into King Ella of Northumbria as vengeance for his father Ragnar Lodbrok's death. Did it truly happen? Perhaps not, but the terror it inspired was very real. For the Vikings, cruelty was a weapon as sharp as any axe. To raid, they needed more than ships and swords. They needed fear. Fear that would break villages before a single blow was struck. Fear that would make kings kneel rather than resist. Tales of the blood eagle spread that fear. Now ask yourself, could you watch such a thing? Could you hear the saw of iron through bone, the wheeze of lungs dragged out into the cold air and not collapse in horror? Could you bear the stench of blood thick in your nostrils, knowing that you might be next? The very thought would shatter you. You would pray for a quicker death, for the mercy of the sword, rather than the wings of the blood eagle. But the Vikings understood. To them, death was not the end, but the gateway to Valhalla. To suffer bravely, to meet agony without a sound, this was honor. To the Northmen, the blood eagle was more than execution. It was theatre. It was vengeance. It was a message carved into flesh for the world to see. Defy the Vikings, and you will not only die, you will be unmade. In most of the medieval world, women were expected to stay behind walls weaving, cooking, raising children. But in the lands of the Vikings, the rules were not so easily written. The sagas tell of women who refused the hearth and instead chose the battlefield. They were called shield maidens. Not every Viking woman became one most tended farms and families while their men sailed. But when danger came, when enemies threatened, it was not unheard of for women to lift axe and spear. And some went further. They trained, fought, and earned a place among warriors. The most famous was Lagertha, a woman said to have fought beside Ragnar Lodbrok himself. The chronicler Saxo Grammaticus wrote of her courage, describing her as fiercer than any man, a storm in the shield wall, her hair flying wild as she carved her way through enemies. Some believed she was more than human, a Valkyrie walking among mortals. But Lagertha was not alone in legend. The sagas whisper of many women who stood shoulder to shoulder with men in raids and battles. Archaeology, too, gives us reason to believe. In Birka, Sweden, the grave of a warrior, long thought to be male, was unearthed complete with sword, shield, and 2 horses. Yet modern science revealed the warrior was female. Whoever she was buried not as a farmer's wife, but as a warrior honoured in death. To be a shield maiden was no easy path. Training was brutal. A girl would learn to wield a spear as tall as herself, to block with a round shield, to cut with axe and sword. She had to match the strength of men twice her size. She had to prove herself in the shield wall, where hesitation meant death. And if she fell in battle, she prayed the Valkyries would carry her to Valhalla, no less worthy than her brothers in arms. Imagine it, the thunder of battle, the clash of shields, and among the roaring warriors, a woman standing tall. Her braid swings as she thrusts her spear, her shield rings with blows, and her enemies falter, shocked to see death carried in the hands of one they thought weak. But do not mistake this for equality as you know it today. The Viking world was still harsh, still ruled by men. Shield maidens were rare, exceptional, and often remembered more in song than in numbers. Yet, their presence shook the expectations of their age. They proved that courage was not bound by gender, only by will. Could you stand where they stood? Could you hold the line as arrows darkened the sky, as men twice your size bore down with axe and fury? Could you bury your fear beneath steel and blood? The Vikings demanded it, and for the few women who chose that path, the sagas gave them immortality. They were shield maidens, and they carved their names into history with the edge of a blade. Death to the Vikings was not an end, but a passage. A warrior's final journey was as important as his first battle. How one was sent to the afterlife determined whether he entered Valhalla, feasted with the gods, or wandered forgotten in the shadows. And so the Viking funeral became one of the most powerful and haunting images of their world, flames on the water, carrying the dead into eternity. The most famous version was the ship burial. The fallen warrior, draped in fine clothes, was laid upon his longship, or within a carved boat set upon the shore. Around him were placed his weapons axe, sword, spear, and shield so he could fight in the next world. Food, drink, and sometimes even sacrificed animals or servants were added, ensuring the dead would not journey hungry or alone. Then came fire. A pyre was built, or the ship itself was set aflame, the crackling blaze licking the sky. The flames roared, sparks drifting like stars, while the smell of burning pitch and pine filled the air. Families and comrades stood silent, watching the warrior's soul ride smoke and flame toward the realm beyond. The ship, glowing in firelight, drifted out onto the black water, a burning beacon in the night. The sagas say that even kings were sent off this way. The funeral of Balder, the beloved son of Odin, was described as the greatest of all. His ship, Ringhorni, the largest in the world, pushed to sea with torches blazing. The gods themselves wept as the vessel burned, carrying Balder to the land of the dead. But not every Viking funeral was fire upon the waves. In some places, the dead were buried beneath great mounds of earth, ship-shaped graves dug deep and filled with treasure, weapons, and offerings. The mound rose like a hill, marking the resting place of a warrior chief or noble family, a reminder to all who passed that here lay one who mattered. And for the poorest, the rites were simpler: a shallow grave, a few possessions, a whispered prayer. Yet even then, the belief was the same, that death was a voyage, and the dead must be equipped to face it. Now, imagine you, standing among them as the flames consume the ship. The heat burns your face, the smoke stings your eyes, and the crackle of wood echoes across the fjord. You smell the mingling of sea and fire, feel the weight of silence as the vessel drifts further, until it is only a glow upon the horizon. The Vikings do not weep loudly, they do not cling. For them, this is honor. Could you bear to watch a loved one burn upon the waves? Could you stand still, offering no tears, only respect? Could you trust that fire and water would carry their soul to the gods? The Vikings did, for to them the funeral was not just death. It was the last voyage of a warrior, a passage to Valhalla, flames on the water, carrying the fallen home. Among the Vikings, there were warriors, and then there were berserkers. To speak their name was to conjure images of madness, rage, and unstoppable force. They were not ordinary men. They were storms wrapped in flesh, unleashed upon the battlefield with fury so terrifying that even their own comrades sometimes feared them. The word berserker means bear shirt, and some believed these warriors fought clad in the hides of bears or wolves, drawing strength from the spirit of the beast. Others claimed they cast aside armor altogether, going into battle nearly naked, as if proof that no blade could harm them. What made them so feared was not their size or strength alone, but the state they entered before combat, a trance of pure animalistic rage. The sagas tell of their frenzy, eyes glowing, mouths foaming, bodies trembling, as if possessed by Odin himself. Once the fury took them, they felt no pain. Swords that would cut down other men seemed to glance off their flesh. They tore through shield walls, biting, clawing, smashing with axe and sword, until the ground ran red beneath their feet. Some even claimed berserkers could shift into wolves or bears in spirit, their human skin only a disguise for the beast within. But fury has a cost. When the madness passed, berserkers were left drained, weak, almost broken. Their bodies, pushed beyond mortal limits, collapsed into exhaustion. Villages feared them, not only in battle but in peace, for their tempers could flare without warning. To live with a berserker was to live beside a fire that might ignite at any moment. Historians wonder if herbs, alcohol, or even mushrooms fueled their rages. Yet to the Vikings, the source did not matter. What mattered was the fear they inspired. In the shield wall, when enemies saw a berserker charging, roaring, eyes wild, many broke ranks before a blow was even struck. Terror won battles as surely as steel. Imagine it. You stand in the Viking shield wall, trembling, your wooden shield slick with sweat. From the enemy ranks comes a howl, bestial and raw. A giant bursts forward, axe raised, his chest bare, eyes burning with madness. He smashes into the line like a thunderbolt, shattering shields, breaking bones, spraying blood. He does not stop. He does not slow. And you realize this is no man you face, but a storm wearing the shape of one. Could you hold your ground? Could you raise your sword as he bore down on you, roaring like a beast from some forgotten age? Or would your legs betray you, your courage dissolve, and your heart pound with terror as you fled? The Vikings knew the answer. Few could withstand the fury of the berserker. They were Odin's chosen, the living embodiment of war's madness. and on the battlefield, they were death itself, clothed in rage. When people today hear the word Viking, they often picture longships cutting through the waves, warriors leaping ashore with axes raised, and villages burning in their wake. And they are not wrong. For centuries, the Vikings were the terror of Europe, their raids feared from the icy coasts of Ireland to the golden halls of Constantinople. A Viking raid was more than simple theft. It was strategy, speed, and sheer brutality. Their longships were the key sleek, shallow-drafted vessels that could glide across open seas and slip up narrow rivers alike. Where other armies were bound to roads, the Vikings brought war by water, striking deep into the heart of kingdoms that thought themselves safe. The raids often began at dawn. Imagine a quiet coastal village, fishermen still hauling nets, women tending fires. Then, on the horizon, dark shapes appear. Longships, their dragon prows rising from the mist, sails full in the wind. The alarm is sounded too late. Within moments, the Vikings hit the shore. Shields lock, axes swing, and chaos erupts. They struck swiftly, taking food, silver, weapons, and slaves. Monasteries were special targets. Not only were they rich in gold and holy treasures, but monks made for easy captives. To the Vikings, Christian holy relics meant nothing. A golden chalice was not a vessel of God, but simply another prize to melt down or trade. Yet the raids were not only about greed. For many Vikings, raiding was a way of life. It was how young warriors proved themselves, how chiefs gained wealth and followers, how families back home survived harsh winters. Each strike carried risk, but also glory. Success brought silver, slaves, and songs. Failure meant death or worse dishonor. And the terror they spread was as powerful as their blades. The mere rumor of Viking sails on the horizon could send villages fleeing. Kings scrambled to fortify coasts, build watchtowers, and pay tribute just to keep the raiders away. Whole regions lived in dread of the Northmen, never knowing when or where they would strike next. But raids were not without rules. Among the Vikings themselves, loot was divided according to strict custom. A share for the leader, a share for the crew, a share for the gods. To cheat in this was to invite blood feud. Even in pillage, there was order. Now picture yourself in such a moment. You are a farmer in Anglo-Saxon England, your thatched roof still smoking from morning fire. Shouts rise, the Northmen are here." You run, clutching a child, as men with horned dragon shields storm your village. Behind you, the church bells ring in panic. Ahead, the river glitters with the sails of more ships. There is nowhere to hide. Could you fight them? Could you face men who lived and breathed war, whose very arrival meant fire and steel? Could you protect your home against those who sailed the sea like wolves hunting prey? For the Vikings, this was life. For their victims, it was terror without end. If there was one weapon more feared than the Viking axe, it was the longship. Sleek, swift, and deadly, these ships were the very heart of Viking power. Without them, there would have been no raids, no exploration, no empire of fear stretching from the fjords of Norway to the gates of Byzantium. The longship was a marvel of design. Crafted from oak, clinker-built with overlapping planks, it was both strong and flexible. Its shallow draft meant it could sail across stormy seas one moment and slip silently up a river the next. No coast, no village, no monastery was safe. Where there was water, the longship could reach. Each ship was crowned with a carved prow, often a dragon or serpent, jaws open in eternal roar. To enemies, these were no mere decorations. They were omens. When villagers saw the dragon heads rise from the mist, they knew death was coming. It was said some Vikings removed the heads before returning home, so as not to offend the land spirits of their own shores. A longship could carry 40 to 60 men, sometimes more. Each warrior had his place along the benches, his oar in hand, his shield hanging from the rail. When the sail caught the wind, the ship flew across the water faster than most could believe possible. And when the wind died, the rower's strength drove it forward, the beat of the drummer keeping perfect rhythm as the ship cut through the waves like a spear. But the longship was more than a war machine, it was freedom. With it, the Vikings crossed oceans that others feared. They sailed to Iceland, to Greenland, even to Vinland, the shores of North America, centuries before Columbus. They braved storms, ice, and endless seas, guided by the sun, stars, and their own iron will. In battle, the longship gave them their edge. They could strike without warning, vanish into the mist, and reappear leagues away. Kingdoms with mighty castles were powerless, for castles guarded roads and fields, not rivers and coasts. The Vikings turned the sea into their highway, and from it they ruled. Imagine standing on a cliff in the 9th century, looking out at the horizon. At first, nothing, just the silver line of the sea. Then, black dots. The dots grow larger, take shape, dragon prows, rows of oars cutting the waves. The sound reaches you, the steady beat of oars, the crash of the sea, the howl of warriors eager for plunder. Your heart sinks. You know that soon, fire will rise and screams will fill the air. Could you outrun such a ship? Could you defend against men who travelled the seas like wolves across snow? The answer, for most, was no. The Viking longship was more than wood and sail. It was terror on the water, the very wings of the Northman's power. Wherever its dragon head pointed, fire and steel soon followed. To live in Viking times was to live under the shadow of vengeance. Justice was not decided by courts or kings, but by blood. If a man was slain, his family was bound by honour to seek payment or revenge. And so began the endless cycle of blood feuds. A Viking's reputation was everything. Wealth could be lost, land could be taken, but honour could never be surrendered. If a father was killed and his sons did nothing, they were branded cowards. If a brother fell and his kin let it pass, their name was stained for generations, and so vengeance was not a choice, it was a duty. The law of the North offered one way out, Wergild, the man price. Every life had a value, depending on status. A farmer, a warrior, a thrall, each had a price. If the killer or his kin paid the Wergild, the feud could be settled. But often, silver could not quench the thirst for honour. Many preferred the axe to the coin. Blood feuds could last years, even decades. One killing led to another, then another, until whole families were caught in the storm. Sons avenged fathers, cousins avenged cousins, neighbours chose sides, and villages were split apart. A single insult, a single strike, could unleash chaos that consumed generations. And these feuds were not fought on battlefields. They erupted in longhouses, at feasts, on lonely forest paths. Imagine sitting at a mead hall, the fire roaring, laughter rising, then a man stands, steel flashing in the firelight. The hall erupts in screams as blood splashes the floorboards, and a clan war begins that no one can stop. Even exile could not always end the feud. A man might flee across seas, settle in new lands, but the memory of his crime would follow. His sons might pay for his sins, his grandchildren hunted for a quarrel long past. Vengeance had no end, only blood, or the rare mercy of forgiveness, could close it. But what of those caught in the middle? Farmers, wives, children, they too suffered. Homes were burned, fields destroyed, lives shattered in the wake of men chasing honour. The strong lived by the sword, but the weak paid the price. Now imagine yourself in this world. You argue with a neighbour over land. Harsh words are spoken, tempers rise. In a single flash, steel is drawn, and a man falls dead. From that moment, your life is no longer your own. His kin will come for you. Not today, perhaps not tomorrow, but soon. You sleep with an axe by your bed. You walk with eyes over your shoulder. Your children grow up knowing that at any moment the feud may claim them too. This was the reality of Viking life. The bonds of family were strong, but so were the chains of vengeance. Could you live in a world where one wrong word, one wrong glance, might doom your bloodline for generations? For the Vikings, this was not fear, it was law. Beyond the northernmost fjords, where the mountains rose like black spears against the sky, there were lands the Vikings feared, not because of storms or sea ice, but because of the people who lived there. They were known only in whispers, the forgotten tribe. The sagas say they were hunters who could stalk even the fiercest wolf, men who could loose an arrow straight through a Viking shield, women who moved silently across snow without leaving a single track. They did not fear the Vikings, they hunted them. Sailors told stories of longships that never returned from those coasts, of warriors found frozen in the snow, their bodies pierced with arrows but their killers unseen. Some claimed the forgotten tribe could vanish into mist, strike from nowhere, then melt back into the land as if it had swallowed them whole. The Vikings gave them many names. Some called them Biarmians, others spirits of the north, half men, half shadow. Around fires in smoky longhouses, old men would lean close and say, "Even Odin does not walk their land." What was truth and what was legend, none could say. But fear was real. A Viking might raid Ireland, Francia, even sail to Miklagard, yet few dared the northern cliffs where the forgotten tribe watched from the mountains. Imagine the scene. Your longship crashes against a shore of black stone. Snow falls in silence, muffling every sound. You and your crew march inland, axes ready, but then a whistle through the air. One man falls, an arrow jutting from his throat. Another drops, pierced through the chest. You raise your shield, but the attack does not stop. The arrows come from nowhere, from everywhere. Panic spreads. You glimpse a shadow moving in the white, then nothing. Your men scream, flee, vanish into the snow. By nightfall, the forgotten hunters have claimed another victory. The forgotten tribe had no walls, no fortresses, no longships. Their strength was the land itself. Mountains, forests, ice, all were their allies. Against them, Viking steel counted for little, and so they remained unconquered, a scar of mystery at the edge of the known world. The stories say they worshipped no gods the Vikings knew, that they spoke to the wind and listened to the ice. Some believed they could cool storms, others that they were cursed descendants of giants. To the Vikings, they were not just men. They were reminders that not all lands could be tamed, not all enemies could be broken. Could you stand on that shore, hearing the sea hammering the cliffs behind you and the whisper of hunters all around? Could you walk where even the fiercest Viking would not tread? For in the age of Vikings, it was not always they who hunted. Sometimes they were the prey. In Viking times, the snow was a map. Hunters could read the trails of elk, wolves, even a man's tired footsteps. But in the far north, sailors spoke of something far stranger, footprints that were never made. The tales told of hunters who could move across fresh snow and leave no trace, warriors who vanished into the white as if the earth itself refused to mark their passing. To Vikings, who prided themselves on tracking prey and foes alike, this was a horror beyond reason. Men with no footprints, they said by the fire, cannot be hunted, cannot be killed. Some claimed it was a skill of the forgotten tribe, that their warriors learned to walk in such harmony with the snow that their steps left no impression. Others whispered it was sorcery, a gift from the spirits of the mountains, or perhaps a curse from Jotun blood. Imagine a raiding party trudging through waist-deep drifts, their boots sinking, their breath rising in steam. They glance behind and see their long trail stretching back to the fjord. But then one man gasps for ahead of them. In the snowfield, they spot movement. A figure in the distance, cloaked in white, gliding silently. They give chase. The stranger moves quickly, but leaves nothing behind, no mark, no track. By the time they reach the spot, the figure has vanished and only silence remains. What do you do when your enemy cannot be followed? When you cannot predict where they will strike, or even know if they were truly there at all? For the Vikings, hunters of men and beasts alike, such a foe was terrifying. The sagas weave darker tales still, of whole war bands lost in the snow, their footprints leading into the mountains, then stopping suddenly as if swallowed by the earth. Some said the hunters of the north could erase a man's very presence, wiping his steps from the world, condemning him to be forgotten. For the Vikings, who lived and died by the strength of memory and legacy, this was the ultimate terror. To fall was one thing, but to vanish without a trace, that was worse than death. It was erasure. But perhaps these were not just stories. Survival in the north demanded cunning beyond brute force. The forgotten tribe lived where snow never melted, where storms raged for months. To master the snow, to move unseen, was not magic. It was survival. The Vikings, bold and brutal, could never match such silence. Now, imagine yourself walking through that frozen land. Behind you, your boots press deep into the white, but ahead of you, nothing. No prints, no sign, no path, though you swear you saw someone watching. Do you chase? Or do you flee, knowing that perhaps you were already the hunted? In the world of the Vikings, even the snow itself could turn against you. For all their might, the Vikings were not masters of their world. They lived in a land of extremes, where nature could be more merciless than any enemy. And when the gods seemed silent, when offerings went unanswered, famine and storms reminded them how fragile life truly was. The Viking Age was no golden paradise. Fields were small, carved from hard soil between mountains and fjords. Crops depended on brief summers that could vanish with a single storm. One bad season, too much rain, too little sun and hunger crept into the longhouses. Children cried in the night, old ones wasted away, and families prayed to Odin, Freya, and Thor for mercy. Sometimes the gods gave none. Famine struck like a slow war. Grain stores ran dry. Livestock starved or were slaughtered too soon, leaving nothing for the winter. Desperation bred violence, neighbour stealing from neighbour, families turning on each other in the night. Warriors, who once raided far-off kingdoms, found themselves too weak to lift a sword. And when hunger did not kill, the sea often tried. The Vikings were people of ships, but the ocean was never tamed. Storms rose with no warning, waves towering higher than longships, winds howling like Jotun voices. A single gale could shatter a fleet, dragging men and timber into the black depths. To sail was to risk never returning, and yet the Vikings had no choice. The sea was their road, their lifeline, and sometimes their grave. The sagas speak of men who swore the gods had abandoned them, of sacrifices made in desperation, gold thrown into the sea, horses slain on the stones, even whispers of darker offerings. For when storms howled and famine gnawed, many believed only the blood of the living could wake the gods from silence. Imagine it, the sky, a wall of black, thunder shaking the earth. You cling to the oar of your longship, the sea rising like mountains around you. Lightning flashes, and for an instant you see the faces of your crewmates, pale with fear, drenched in rain. The mast snaps, the sail rips, the ship groans. You shout to Thor, but no answer comes. Only the crash of waves, the roar of wind, the certainty that death is near. In the hall of feasting, such tales were told with pride, men who defied the storm, who braved the famine. But alone, in the cold silence of a dark winter, the fear was real. For in Viking times, courage did not always save you. Steel could not cut hunger, no axe could strike a storm. And so they endured, praying that the gods would remember them. For when the gods turned away, even the strongest Viking was helpless before the wrath of nature. This great war horn was not just an instrument, it was a voice of doom. Its deep, thunderous cry rolled across the valleys, echoing against cliffs and carrying for miles. To the Vikings, it was the sound of enemies approaching, of fire soon to be kindled, of steel soon to clash. Picture the scene: a village at dawn, smoke rising lazily from the hearths. Children chase one another along the shoreline, while men mend nets and women churn butter. Then the horn sounds. Long, low, and terrible. The ground seems to hum with it. Birds scatter into the sky, dogs bark wildly, and the laughter of children stops instantly. Everyone knows what it means. Shields are snatched from walls. Spears are thrust into shaking hands. Old men grab axes, though their bones ache with age. Mothers gather their children and rush toward the woods. The warriors form quickly, not out of calm, but out of grim necessity. For once the horn has sounded, there is no time to think, only to prepare. The Gallahorn was more than a warning. It was also a weapon of fear. When sounded from the decks of a longship, it carried ahead of the raiders like a shadow. Monks on distant shores wrote of hearing that dreadful call, their hearts breaking before the first torch was thrown. To hear the horn was to know the storm was already upon you. The Vikings themselves believed the horn belonged to Heimdallr, the watchman of the gods. At the world's end, Ragnarok, it would be blown to summon the final battle. To hear it in mortal life, then, was a reminder: war is never far, and death may be closer still. Imagine standing in a wooden hall as the horn sounds outside. Your cup of ale trembles in your hand. Warriors glance at one another, fear flashing in their eyes, quickly buried under anger. The chieftain slams his axe on the table and shouts for men to the boats. In that instant, you understand. The horn is not just a sound, it is the heartbeat of the North, the call to kill or be killed. For those who lived in Viking times, you would not last a day if the horn found you unprepared. It was the sound of fate catching up, the promise of fire and steel. And once it was heard, there was no turning back. Across the fjords, the Gallahorn still echoes in the sagas, a reminder that in the age of Vikings, even the air itself could carry terror. When the Vikings came, there was no mercy. Villages that had stood for generations vanished in the span of a single night, consumed by fire and steel. To live in those times was to know that at any moment, everything you owned, your home, your crops, even your family, could be torn away by raiders who struck like wolves in the dark. The longship was the perfect weapon of surprise. With shallow keels, it could glide silently up rivers, slipping deep inland where no one thought danger could reach. A village might go to sleep beneath a quiet moon, the night air filled with the sound of crickets and the smell of wood smoke. By dawn, the sky was black with smoke, and nothing remained but ashes and corpses. The Vikings moved with terrifying speed. Doors were kicked open, shields crashing against wooden frames. Farmers barely had time to reach for a pitchfork before iron axes split them down. Mothers grabbed children and tried to flee, but the raiders were faster. Gold, food, cloth, and slaves, everything of value was seized in moments. And then came the fire. Houses burned quickly, their thatched roofs exploding into flame. Sparks leapt from one home to another until the whole village roared with fire. The smell of burning wood mixed with that of charred flesh. The screams of the living drowned beneath the crackle of the blaze. It was not war as we know it today, it was terror made flesh. The sagas often glorify the raids, but for those who endured them, it was nightmare given form. Imagine waking to the crash of axes and the bellow of horns, the light of fire spilling through the cracks in your walls. You stumble outside, barefoot, into chaos, your neighbours dead on the ground, your livestock fleeing, the air thick with smoke. Warriors in helmets and furs descend on you, their faces painted, their axes dripping. In that moment, there is no appeal, no negotiation, only death or chains. To the Vikings, this was survival. Raiding fed their people when harvests failed. It gave them silver to trade, slaves to labor, and glory to boast of in the mead halls. But to everyone else, it was pure destruction. What made the Vikings so feared was not only their ferocity, but their relentlessness. They did not stop with one raid. Villages were rebuilt, only to burn again. Monasteries were plundered year after year, until their walls became nothing more than blackened ruins. No fortress seemed strong enough, no coast safe enough. That is why, in Viking times, there was no true shelter from steel. A village could vanish in a single night, and those who survived carried the scars for life if they were lucky enough to escape at all. Death was never the end in Viking times. To the Norse, the grave was not a quiet place of rest, but a threshold where something darker lingered. They told stories of the Draugr corpses that refused to stay buried, rising from their mounds to haunt the living. A Draugr was not a ghost, but a body. Pale, bloated, and reeking of rot, it carried the strength of 10 men. These creatures were said to guard treasure buried with them, crushing thieves with iron grip or splitting skulls with superhuman force. In sagas, warriors who faced a Draugr spoke of skin black as night, of glowing eyes, of voices like wind through a grave mound. The fear of the dead shaped Viking burial rites. Warriors were often buried with weapons, food, and even sacrificed animals or slaves, not just to aid them in the afterlife, but to keep their spirits satisfied. Stones were sometimes placed over corpses, or stakes driven through them, to prevent them from clawing their way back to the world of the living. Imagine standing at the edge of a burial mound on a stormy night. The wind howls across the fjord, and the earth seems to shift under the weight of the dead. Farmers whisper that the old chieftain still walks, searching for his sword, angry that it was stolen from his grave. In the distance, you see a shadow move against the lightning, too large, too heavy to be a man. You run, but you know the Draugr is behind you, and if it touches you, your bones will snap like twigs. But it wasn't only Draugr that terrified the Norse. Spirits wandered the forests, rivers, and mountains. Some were the Vatir, nature beings that could bring blessings if honoured, or curses if angered. Others were restless souls, doomed to wander for crimes committed in life. To the Vikings, the world was alive with unseen presences, and every shadow in the night might be more than it seemed. These stories served a purpose. They warned the living not to disturb the dead, not to break oaths, not to steal from graves. But they also revealed something deeper. Even the Vikings, fierce as they were, feared forces they could not fight with axe or shield. To live in Viking times meant living with death at every turn in battle, in hunger, in sickness. And when the dead refused to stay in their graves, fear followed every footstep in the dark. You would not last a day among them, not when every burial mound might hide something waiting to rise, and every whisper of wind could carry the voice of the dead. When Vikings clashed in war, the battlefield did not fall silent once the fighting ended. Victory was marked not by glory, but by the groans of the dying and the circling of birds. For the Norse, war was a gift to the gods, and the ravens were always waiting to collect their share. The raven was sacred to Odin, the Allfather, god of wisdom and war. His 2 birds, Hugin and Munin, were said to fly across the world, bringing him news of men's fates. But on the battlefield, real ravens swarmed the skies, drawn by the smell of spilled blood. The sagas speak of fields black with feathers, where corpses were picked apart before the sun had set. The Vikings even had a phrase for it, feeding the ravens. To kill an enemy was not only victory, but an offering to Odin. To fall in battle was to become part of that feast, your body left as food for birds and wolves. In this way, war was a kind of ritual, and its aftermath was a horror beyond imagining. Picture the scene. Warriors lie scattered across a frozen field, their shields splintered, their axes slick with blood. Some groan and crawl, clutching wounds too deep to heal. The victors walk among them, finishing the fallen with a knife to the throat. Smoke rises from burning houses nearby, and above it all, the black shapes of ravens circle lower, their harsh cries echoing across the fjord. The birds strike first at the soft places, eyes, lips, and tongues. Wolves emerge from the tree line, slinking toward the dead. For those still alive, the sight is worse than any wound to feel the weight of a raven on your chest, its beak tearing at your flesh as you breathe your last. To the Vikings, this was not cruelty, it was the natural order. Life fed death, and death fed life. The warrior's body was a sacrifice, not wasted, but consumed by the creatures sacred to Odin. In their harsh world, this was the closest thing to immortality, to be remembered in song and to nourish the earth or the ravens. But for you, standing in that time, it would be unbearable. To see comrades or family reduced to carrion, to hear the crunch of beaks in the silence after battle, to know that if you fell, there would be no burial, no peace, only the tearing of flesh in the cold daylight. This was the true price of war in the Viking Age. Not just the clash of steel, but the feast that followed. And in that feast, there was no dignity, only the endless hunger of the ravens. In the Viking world, strength alone could not carry you through life. No man, no matter how fierce, could survive without his brothers in arms. Loyalty was the foundation of every raid, every voyage, every battle. But loyalty was also fragile, held together by oaths sworn in blood, and sometimes shattered by betrayal. Among Vikings, to swear an oath was sacred. Warriors often bound themselves together through blood brotherhood, cutting their palms and letting their blood mingle. With this ritual, two men became more than friends. They became kin, bound by the gods themselves. To break such an oath was to invite the wrath of Odin and Thor, and worse, to invite dishonor. On longships, these bonds were tested daily. You rowed together, fought together, bled together. Each man's life depended on the man beside him. One faltering stroke at the oar, one wavering stance in battle, and the whole crew could be lost. This trust was so absolute that some warriors would rather die beside their brothers than live in shame without them. But oaths cut both ways. A Viking's life was built on ambition for wealth, land, or power. And when ambition clashed with loyalty, betrayal could be just as brutal as any axe blow. The sagas are filled with stories of warriors turning on their comrades, of brothers killing brothers over treasure, of leaders betrayed by men they trusted most. Imagine this: a raiding crew lands on foreign shores, their shields raised, their axes dripping after a bloody fight. They seize silver, gold, and slaves, enough to enrich them all. But in the night, while the fire burns low, one man rises and drives a blade into his brother's chest, claiming more than his share. By dawn, trust is shattered, and the survivors know that their greatest threat was never the enemy across the sea. It was the greed within their own hall. For Vikings, betrayal was worse than death. To fall in battle was an honor, but to die at the hand of a supposed brother was a stain that echoed in every saga. Some were cursed to wander without rest, their names spat upon, their families shamed. Others, though, grew powerful through treachery, feared more than loved, ruling not through loyalty but through fear. The bonds of Viking brotherhood were iron strong, but iron can break, and when it did, it broke violently. To live in that world meant placing your life in the hands of men who could either lift you to glory or cut you down for silver. Could you trust so completely? Could you bare your palm, let your blood mingle with another's, knowing that trust was all that stood between you and death? For in the age of Vikings, loyalty was a shield, but betrayal was a blade, and sometimes the deadliest of all. The Vikings are remembered as fierce raiders, fearless sailors, and hardened warriors. But the truth is, much of their struggle was not against enemy armies, it was against the cold, unrelenting grip of winter. In Scandinavia, winters were long, dark, and merciless. Snow buried the land for months, seas froze over, and fields lay barren. Even the strongest warrior could be reduced to weakness when the food stores ran low. Victory in summer meant survival in winter, for all the silver and slaves in the world were useless if you had no bread or meat when the snow came. Viking farms were the lifeline of their society. Families worked tirelessly in spring and summer, gathering hay, preserving fish, drying meat, and storing grain in wooden bins. But no matter how well they prepared, famine always loomed. A bad harvest, a failed hunt, or an early frost could mean starvation. Imagine sitting inside a smoky longhouse as the icy winds howl outside. The fire crackles, but the smoke stings your eyes because the chimney is little more than a hole in the roof. Children cry with hunger. The stew in the pot is thin, little more than water flavoured with scraps of bone and dried herbs. Warriors who once wielded axes now gnaw on fish skins, hoping to trick their bellies into silence. The sagas tell of winters so harsh that even wolves, desperate for food, came down from the forests to prowl near the villages. Men risked their lives in the freezing dark, hunting elk or reindeer with nothing but spears. Some never returned, swallowed by the snowstorms. Others were found frozen, still clutching their weapons, their faces locked in expressions of hunger and pain. Starvation was not just a threat to common folk, even kings and jarls suffered. Wealth might buy you a larger storehouse, but winter was a great equalizer. Without fresh food, scurvy crept in, teeth loosened, and flesh withered. The strongest warrior could waste away before spring thawed the earth. And yet, hunger shaped the Viking spirit. It drove them to raid foreign shores, to risk stormy seas for the chance at better land, to fight and kill for grain and cattle. The hunger of winter forged the hunger for conquest. Without the cold, without famine, the Vikings might never have become the terror of Europe. But imagine yourself in their place. Days of endless darkness, the gnawing ache in your belly, the hopelessness of watching your family grow weaker with each passing night. No feast, no raid, no battle cry, only silence, snow and hunger. This was the true enemy the Vikings faced every year. Not always the Saxons, not always the Franks, but winter itself, a foe that no blade could kill. In Viking times, justice was not handed down in courts with powdered wigs and parchment scrolls. It was forged in the open air, under the watchful eyes of kin and clan, where reputation mattered more than written law. And when disputes could not be settled with words or compensation, there remained one brutal method to decide guilt or innocence: trial by ordeal. The Vikings believed the gods would not let an innocent man suffer unjustly. If a man was accused of theft, witchcraft, or even betrayal, he could be forced to prove his innocence through an ordeal that tested his body and spirit. These trials were not designed for fairness. They were designed to let fate, or the gods themselves, choose the outcome. One common ordeal was the hot iron test. The accused would be forced to carry a red-hot piece of iron in his bare hands. His wounds would then be bound and examined days later. If the burns festered and grew worse, the gods had spoken guilty. If they healed cleanly, he was innocent. Another was the cold water trial. The accused would be thrown into a body of water, bound hand and foot. To sink was to be judged innocent, embraced by the earth and sea. To float was to be cursed, rejected by the natural world as guilty. Innocent men sometimes drowned. Guilty men sometimes lived. The gods were cruel judges. There were even trials where the accused had to walk barefoot across burning coals or plunge their hands into boiling water to retrieve a stone. Survival was rare, and scars were guaranteed. But in the Viking mind, those scars were proof either of guilt or of divine favour. Yet not all ordeals were physical. At the Thing, the great assembly of free men, disputes could be settled by oath. A man might swear upon Thor's hammer or Odin's name that he spoke truth. But if later found false, his punishment was exile, or worse, outlawry, stripped of all protection, free for anyone to kill. Imagine yourself standing in the circle, accused of a crime you did not commit. The crowd watches, their faces lit by torchlight, their voices whispering your fate. A priest thrusts a glowing piece of iron into your hand, and you feel your skin blister as the smell of burning flesh fills the air. You grit your teeth, praying your wounds will heal clean because your life depends on it. In Viking times, justice was as harsh as the land itself. No lawyers, no appeals, only gods, fire, water, and blood. Could you endure it? Could you trust your life to the judgment of the elements? The Vikings did. And many did not survive. To the Vikings, death was not an end but a passage. A warrior's life was a storm of raids, battles, and blood oaths, and when that storm ended, his send-off had to be worthy of the sagas. No man who lived by fire and steel would be laid to rest quietly in the earth. He would be given to the flames, sent to the gods on a pillar of smoke, the funeral pyre. Funerals were not private affairs. They were spectacles, ceremonies of fire, feasting, and sometimes sacrifice. Families and comrades gathered not only to mourn but to honor the dead, to make sure the warrior's spirit traveled to the right place, Valhalla, Freya's fields, or the shadowy halls of hell. The body was laid upon a great pyre of timber, often with weapons, armor, and personal belongings. A sword, perhaps blood-stained from battle, a shield, painted with the colors of his clan. Sometimes even the bones of a favorite horse or the carcass of a loyal hound, slain to accompany its master beyond the grave. For a wealthy chieftain or jarl, slaves might be sacrificed as well, forced to follow their lord into death. As the crowd gathered, skalds recited poems, praising the warrior's deeds, recounting raids and victories. Horns of mead were raised, songs were sung, and the air grew heavy with smoke and sorrow. The women wailed, their voices carrying the grief of the living into the night sky. Then came the moment of fire. Torches were set to the wood, flames licking at the timbers until they roared into an inferno. The heat was unbearable, sparks leaping into the wind like glowing spirits. The body, once so fierce in life, became ash and smoke, rising skyward to join the gods. The funeral pyre was both terrifying and beautiful. It was destruction and transformation. Fire consumed the flesh but freed the soul. The Vikings believed that the crackling flames were a bridge to the other world, carrying the warrior across the divide between the living and the dead. Not all Viking funerals were the same. Some warriors were burned in ships, their vessels set ablaze and pushed out to sea, the flames reflecting across black waves. Others were buried in great mounds, surrounded by riches, livestock, and weapons. But the fire remained the most powerful symbol, a reminder that all men, no matter how strong, end as smoke on the wind. Now imagine yourself among them. The night is cold, but the fire's heat stings your face. The smell of burning flesh and pine fills the air. Sparks sting your eyes as you watch a man, perhaps your friend, your kin, vanish into the flames. His sword melts, his body blackens, his spirit rises, and you know, one day it will be your turn. For in Viking times, death was certain. Only the manner of your passing and the story told of it could grant you immortality.